This is to give you 3 questions and 1 comment that have come in since the webinar on nonviolence and terrorism. If you remember during the webinar, if you haven't heard the webinar yet, it will be on our website soon. During the webinar, someone asked me about police brutality, and I answered from the point of view of what might cause a police officer to be in that kind of situation. So here, let me just read the follow-up question. Seems like Michael's answer did not take into consideration institutional racism, nor that the police are shooting children in obviously non-threatening situations, and that the militarization of police is a culture-wide method of response to all situations. So that seemed like a very fair comment. I would say that I think I did address those questions, but I addressed them in my own way, which is not to look at the particulars of the individual case so much as the background. You know, we have this concept in nuclear science about a background count, that there's a certain amount of radiation going on all the time. So let's say it's 17 clicks per minute on a Geiger counter, and you want to know how radioactive something is. You get 25 clicks, you have to subtract 17 to know how much is due to that thing. I've always found this a useful model because it may be difficult to address the violence in that situation by that type of person. But one thing we can always do, slowly and indirectly, is to reduce the background count. So I approached institutional racism and police brutality in the same way that I approached terrorism. If you remember, we had that mantra, if you will, that terrorism cannot be condoned, but it can be understood. So Professor Galtung's comments were all about how to understand what's motivating the terrorists, the Islamic terrorists like the Islamic State. And I addressed that from in a personal, motivational, emotional point of view. And I pointed out that they are enraged and humiliated, and that we can approach that humiliation by giving them meaning, something to live for. So similarly with the police, my first response to this really terrible problem is to try to understand them. And what that accomplishes is it gets us to stop demonizing them, and we can then enter into a dialogue with them and adjust the situation. So it may seem like I was condoning police violence by trying to explain it, but not in the slightest. I do not condone it at all, but I think that it can be understood. And we can understand the pressures that are on anybody to be violent today. We can understand the way that violence has been dramatized and made exciting, and on the mass media, which, you know, police officers watch television like everybody else. So it was a parallel response to my response to terrorism in general, and that accounts for the militarization of the police, that we're in a trap of using more and more force to counteract the violence in any given situation. And the more force we use, the more violence we create. So one has to step out of that picture altogether, and everybody in it, from whatever position they're in, has to learn a nonviolent response. So I hope that's clear. I'm approaching this thing on the cultural level and asking myself, how can we understand what these people are up against, in this case, police officers. Fortunately, it'd be a lot easier to reach them than it would to reach ISIS. And in fact, I didn't mention that yet, but it just occurs to me now, if we could solve that problem, it would give us a model for solving the problem of terror. If we solve domestic terrorism, it'll give us a model for solving international terrorism. So I think it's a really interesting thing for us to approach with this viewpoint. Okay, so Bob Roach, whom I know, has asked this. I am often confronted with the Columbine argument that in extreme situations, violence is necessary to save lives. Is violence ever necessary? Well, the answer, it kind of depends on what you mean by violence. You remember that Gandhi had a situation, hypothetical, I think, where people asked him, what do I do if somebody's attacking the village? He said, if somebody is coming through the village with a sword, the person who dispatches that lunatic will be doing himself and the villagers a favor. However, when you go on and look further into his prescription, his suggestion, what do you do when you're at that third stage of the escalation curve and you're confronted with outright violence? What do you do? He said that if you approach it with the following three things embedded in your attitude, he would even not consider it a violent act. It being using aggressive force to stop the shooter, the terrorist, the Columbine argument. And those three things are, as far as possible, try to do this not in a state of anger and fear. If you are angry against the attacker, you are actually, you are in a state of himsa. Because if you remember from my book, himsa, or violence, actually means probably the intention to harm. So if you have to even use a weapon to stop a shooter because you need to save other people, including yourself, if you're disposed to do that, if you do that without anger and fear, it isn't really violence. It's not himsa, because the intention is not to harm. The intention is to save. The intention is to protect. So that's the first thing. The second thing is you may get injured in the process. You have to be ready for that. And remember, I told the story of Adel Termos, who jumped on the suicide bomber in Beirut and died in the process. They both died, but he probably saved the life of his daughter and maybe 100 other people by that act. So in that extreme stage, you may have to risk your life in order to bring about a stoppage of the violence. And it's a terrible thing, but let's try not to let situations get that far. Okay. So I would say that abusive force may be necessary, but it isn't really violence. Now you get to the third criterion, and that is don't use this as a model. Don't prepare for violence. Don't give every airline pilot a gun. Don't give every school teacher a gun. These are emergency situations only. Because Gandhi's logic was, if you have time to prepare, you should prepare nonviolence. It's much more effective. Okay, and then the third question was, how can a woman react nonviolently in the situation of rape? I think that's very similar. If you're in an extreme situation, third phase of the escalation curve, do what you feel you have to do. Gandhi actually suggested using whatever you've got. You know, you've got long fingernails, scratch away, do anything that you can to prevent that from happening, because for him, that was the extremist form of violence because it involved degradation, humiliation. So again, probably not best to prepare for this, though, you know, I have nothing against chemical mace and whistles and things like that. But the one thing that we should all be thinking about and doing is how to create a culture where this doesn't happen. You know, there are cultures, there are societies in which women can walk about safely, and that's a situation that we must get back to progressively. But if you are if you are a woman and you're caught in that situation, do anything that you can do, not even short of killing. Yeah, if you feel that would stop the situation. And then the comment was about the occupation of Tibet, which came up during the webinar. And the commentator says this connects to the nuclear weapons issue because the Chinese use the high mountains as excellent places for their weapons. So we have another reason for global nuclear disarmament. I couldn't agree more, as if we needed more reasons for global nuclear disarmament. I think for those of us who are interested in that issue, the primary thing we have to address in people's minds is the fear. Because those weapons are there in the belief that they are protecting you, and to renounce them causes a tremendous fear. So anything that we can do to reduce international tension and reduce fear in general is going to provide an infrastructure for a political, a policy approach to nuclear disarmament. So thank you very much for those questions and that comment. This is what has come in so far. Questions to Professor Galton will be answered differently. We're going to give them to him in writing, and they will be available on the web page that's dedicated to the Nonviolence and Terrorism webinar. So again, thank you very much. And if you have additional questions, please feel free to send them in. So yours for a nonviolent world.